Acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs and the University of Iowa's honors program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and I thank today's special financial sponsors, Midwest One Bank and Mace and K. Braverman. Our programs are made possible by the financial support of these sponsors. Today's program will be presented by a truly remarkable, exceptionally high-achieving student, Jeffrey Ding. I would like to take a moment before introducing Jeffrey to recognize another group of distinguished students. The University of Iowa, for the second consecutive year, has again achieved a record number of 14 U.S. Student Program awardees. Ed asked me to mention this. Jeffrey Ding was born in Shanghai, China, and raised in Iowa City since the age of 3. Jeffrey is a University of Iowa senior with a triple major in Chinese, political science, and economics. After receiving a Stanley Award for undergraduate research through the Stanley UI Support Organization in 2014, Jeffrey's sophomore year, he has gone on to win 4 prestigious academic awards, including the Boren, Udall, Truman, and Rhodes Scholarships. This fall, Jeffrey will begin 2 years as a Rhodes Scholar in Cambridge, England. Jeffrey will speak to us today on an interest group with Chinese characteristics, the role of the national oil companies in the South China Sea. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Ding.
Thanks everyone for having me here. I'm getting my wisdom teeth taken out tomorrow, so this is a good last chance to impart some wisdom. I've had the pleasure of having great professors here, especially in the political science department. Professor Wang Fangtang, who's in China right now, has been a really great mentor to me. And I think the best professors are able to do 2 things. They're able to complicate issues and then simplify them. Today I can only promise the former, but I'll strive to do the latter. Just a little bit more about my background. Karen kind of already went through it, but ICFRC I've always tried to come to these lunches because it's been the intersection of 2 really great programs, the honors program and international programs. And I've worked with Karen on the Stanley application, and that was one of the research grants, especially with the Stanley UI Foundation support organizations, financial support of that grant. That was kind of what sparked my interest in researching more about China, actually spending a winter break there, and then also worked with Karen on the Boren Scholarship application, which supported my, this half year I was in Beijing studying abroad at Peking University, taking some classes with Chinese undergraduate students. And one of those classes was where I learned more about these national oil companies and wanted to do this topic. So let's get into it. This presentation will cover 3 parts. The first is I'll just talk broadly about an interest group approach to Chinese foreign policy, and then we'll talk specifically about national oil companies and the South China Sea with a focus on central government versus national oil company interactions. And then the third, we'll talk about some other interest groups with Chinese characteristics. So a lot of the literature around Chinese interest groups in the South, Chinese interest groups in general, with regards to foreign policy, comes down to a 3-tier framework. And it starts with the center. And you can see there listed, you have the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the 9 members out of the 25-member Politburo, who are usually the most powerful members in the party. Then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the People's Liberation Army. And I actually got the idea to learn more about this in that class at Peking University, it was a really interesting class. There were students from Thailand, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, and they would all do a project related to their interests. So a lot of them would research China and their own country's interactions. And in this class, the professor, in one of his lectures, he mentioned that China in their foreign policy has three primary aims, or three interests that they want to safeguard. The first is economic development, which has been a primary driver since Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up period. Second is territorial sovereignty. And third is taking on more responsibility in international affairs. And he mentioned that oftentimes there are groups associated with these aims. For example, strong business interests will want to promote economic development. Perhaps the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, will want to promote sovereignty aims, and perhaps the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be more interested in getting China to participate in international rules and regulations. And you can see how these will sometimes interact and conflict. So that got me thinking and made me want to learn more about these interest groups. And I was most interested in this second group on the margin. These large state-owned oil enterprises, these local governments, provincial governments, and then research institutions, universities, think tanks. And what's interesting about these interest groups is when you think of interest groups in the US, you think US Chamber of Commerce, or businesses that or non-governmental organizations that have no connection really to the government. But in China, these state-owned enterprises are technically government-owned. And these research institutions, some of them are considered national research institutions or state-level research institutions. So they have a lot of the literature refers to them as quasi-governmental structures. So I thought that would present interesting effects on foreign policy making. And then the third, the outside ring, is the media, netizens, what is happening on the internet, and public opinion in general. I think the big takeaway, even from just this beginning framework, is that we often think of China as having a monolithic foreign policy. But in fact, there are a lot of competing interests, and it's a multifaceted foreign policy. And in order to deal with China properly, we need to understand this multifaceted nature of their foreign policy making. Okay, so let's get into some of these national oil companies. These three are known as the oil giants. And you have Sinopec, CNPC, and CNOOC, all ranked very high in the Fortune Global 500, which measures companies based off of total revenues. So the first two are bigger than ExxonMobil, and they are mostly focused on oil refining, oil production, while the third, which we'll talk a lot more about, has a near monopoly on offshore resources, and they do a lot of China's offshore oil and gas development. One interesting thing to consider is whether there's a question of whether they function as a unified interest group. For the purposes of my research and what I'm interested in studying, I considered them as one for a couple reasons. They've cooperated in the past as almost a cartel-like entity to reduce output in order to force the government to raise electricity prices. And also, China almost treats them as an interest group as well. The central government has in recent years rotated the heads of different of these different companies. So you would have like the third ranking member of Sinopec become the general manager or the CEO of CNOOC. So these are the three companies we'll be looking at today. One of the big historical drivers of how these interest groups have risen to power was China's establishment of the going out policy in 1999 to promote internationalization, overseas investment. That, along with 2001 accession to the WTO, really sparked an era of companies going out, and the NOCs were the vanguard of this broader movement. In particular, there was a lot of scholars refer to this period as petroleum diplomacy, where China central government, foreign ministry would be pulled to areas like Sudan in order to protect the assets and the companies and the workers that were already in that region because of the work of national oil companies. So that's one direct effect as to how throughout history national oil companies have pulled along the Chinese foreign ministry. In one of the negotiations for Sudan, the UN peacekeeping mission there, one of their aims, China actually got inserted into their aims was to protect Chinese oil workers. So you can see how those negotiations were explicitly to protect their NOC interests. Over the years, though, from 2000 to the present, there's been two leaders. First was Hu Jintao, second was Xi Jinping, who is the current leader, and he's still in his first term. And I just took a look at their foreign visits, so their official state visits to different countries. And 63.64% of Hu Jintao's visits were to countries with NOC interests. What that means is, what I took that to mean was if the NOC had assets in that country or if they were actively looking to purchase a company in that country. But you can see how in the next regime, that number had a slight decline. It's still very, very high. So like over 50% of their visits are to these countries. And it has taken a slight decline. And later we'll talk more about perhaps why. But one theory I want to posit is that China is participating in more international forums, becoming a more active participant in international law regime, and like joining a lot of these international bodies. So they don't need to, they're transitioning into a more responsible global player potentially. So you're seeing a decrease in visits to countries with NOC interests. Yeah, China Vitae is a great resource if you're ever interested in what the Chinese elite do on a day-to-day basis. You can they track all of their visits and all of their meetings. So just a couple, now let's zoom in the historical context more specifically to the South China Sea. One jumping off point that I found really helpful was 1990, because before 1990, China was only interested in protecting 6 islands in the Spratly Islands, in those 6 red dots down there, and the Paracel Islands. But 1990, there was a lot of worry about a looming oil crisis in China and the need to import more oil. So they wanted to ramp up their own development of offshore oil and gas resources. So CNOOC, which was the third NOC we showed a little bit earlier, was actually created, was originally a state ministry that was tasked with developing offshore oil and gas resources to satisfy Chinese increased demand. And since then, now China is pushing for the 9-dash line, which is shown in the red. That is about 85% of the entire South China Sea that China claims territorial sovereignty over. You can see how some of this is over 1,000 miles from their continental shelf. A couple of things to note is that about their 9-dash line intersects or infringes on the exclusive economic zone of a lot of countries, which is 200 miles from the continental shelf of places like Vietnam and the Philippines, and that's where a lot of the disputes come from. So just to give a little bit more of a timeline of how the development of oil interests in the South China Sea has happened throughout time, to give you a little bit more context, you can see how coverage of the South China Sea in the context of oil and gas resources has spiked in 2 timeframes. One is 2011 to 2012, and one is 2014. And throughout time, it has just gotten more and more entrenched as a oil and gas interest. But the 2011-2012 spike, one explanation is during that time, Chinese and Vietnamese oil survey ships clashed. And then the following year, CNOOC announced the opening of 9 blocks of maritime development for oil and gas resources in areas that infringed upon Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, which is that 200-mile range I was showing you on the map before. So that set off a lot of international outrage. The 2014 spike is interesting because that was the deployment of Haiyang Shiyou 981, which is an oil rig created by CNOOC. And it was deployed also to an atoll that was in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, and that sparked protests at Chinese embassy in Vietnam, widespread condemnation from the international community as well. So those are a couple of just linkages to how oil interests have really increased the big events that are driving South China Sea being tied to oil interests. I think one of the hardest things to do with research in Chinese foreign policy making is just that a lot of these things happen in back rooms and in confidential meetings where we just don't have access. And a lot of people refer to it as a black box. For example, some of the best interest group research relies on surveys of business leaders. For example, a survey of business leaders and elites in the US, and then a survey of policymakers in the US, and then you do like time lag analysis to see if over time the policymakers eventually their opinions tend more toward the business leaders, or whether tend more toward academic think tank institutions. But those surveys for the elites just don't exist in China. So it's difficult to do this type of analysis. But when I was in the class, the professor pointed me to this Harvard professor named Alistair Ian Johnston, and he does some really cool analysis, also a lot of like number of newspaper articles, relative frequency analysis. And when he was researching the People's Liberation Army influence on the South China Sea, he looked at the People's Liberation Army's daily newspaper and compared it to the People's Daily newspaper, which is the voice of the civilian government versus the voice of the military government. And he did a similar frequency search, but he did it for the word sovereignty. And that's a particularly good word because it translates perfectly into a Chinese word, 主权. And it also highlights whether the military and the civilian government would agree in terms of their mouthpieces, their media mouthpieces, whether those correlated. And he found that those correlated not only in like the trend, but also in how close they were in terms of mentions. And so I tried to do a similar thing, comparing the mouthpiece of keeping the People's Daily mouthpiece, which is of the civilian government, and then using an oil central news collector. CNPC does the best like news platform that collates a lot of what is important to oil companies. And I just checked out of the articles that mention the South China Sea, all the articles that are relevant to the South China Sea, was there a similar consistency in the sovereignty frequency appearing in these articles as there was for military and civilian government? And it's pretty clear that that's not the case. And one thing to note is the oil companies mention sovereignty a lot less than the central government. And it's just one way to highlight differences in interests. So I thought that sovereignty would be the most a priori interest of the Chinese government. It's listed as one of their core interests, while joint development, which is setting the sovereignty issue aside, but let's actually get these oil and gas resources, because a lot of these oil and gas resources that are in disputed waters either have not been explored because there's been so much debate and consternation over sovereignty issues, or because the sovereignty issues have had like a chilling effect, a deterrent effect on any oil and gas exploration in these resources. So from the perspective of the national oil companies, they would want joint development. Joint development actually occurs between China and Japan in the Chunxiao oil development gas fields. So it shows that is a potential China. There's no ban against joint development in China's foreign policy repertoire. So I thought this would be an interesting test to do. And if you do it for joint development, there's more of a correlation in terms of the trend, but you can see that the government definitely does not prioritize joint development as much as the oil companies in terms of what they want out of the South China Sea. And over time, there's been a steep decline in joint development efforts. In that 2012 to 2013 time range, CNUC had begun to offer, really actively offer joint development opportunities to both foreign governments and multinational corporations as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about, as we see this tension, so I've talked a little bit about the history of how national oil and gas companies have driven China's foreign policy making throughout the world, and especially a couple events in the South China Sea. But I do want to talk about a recent trend, which I think that the central government is expanding its control and reconsolidating control over the foreign policy-making process, particularly with regards to the national oil companies. And I want to use this guy as an example, Zhou Yongkang. So let's just do a little game here. Who do you all think are the two people at the bottom right? Koch brothers, right? I actually feel a little sorry for them. They were just referred to as one person, as if they didn't have any individual agency. What about bottom left corner? Yep, director IMF. Top right corner. Okay, and then middle, Larry Page, co-founder of Google. And all these people in 2011 were ranked lower than Zhou Yongkang in the world's most powerful people rankings. So that just shows you how powerful he was in 2011. And at one point, he was considered China's third most powerful man. And his career started in 1996, where he was the general manager of CMPC, which was the middle NOC that I showed you a while ago. And general manager is basically leader of the company. From then, he moved on to be the party secretary of Sichuan, which is the leading provincial post. And then he rose to that Politburo Standing Committee, which is the 9-member most powerful body in China. He was the head of the ministry. He was the Minister of Public Security, but he was always in this oil petroleum clique, and even when he was about to fall, there was a story about how he went to a CMPC post and says, "I will always be an oil man," or said something about. So he had this deep connection to the oil industry, and throughout his time, a couple of things highlighted how his rise also fueled the power of this interest group of these national oil companies. The first is when he was in the Ministry of Public Security, he internationalized law enforcement for marine vessels. So that allowed coast guards and also fishing vessels and cutters under the Ministry of Public Security to enforce and to help fishing vessels or accompany oil and gas ships. The second was when CNUC launched the Haiyang Shiyou 981 that I talked about earlier, the oil rig that set off protests. A lot of analysts said they were only able to do that bold of an action because Wang Yiling, who was the chairman of CNUC, had the support of Zhou Yongkang, who at that time was still very powerful. So you can see how this power base empowers these national oil companies to be more aggressive than they would have been. And it also sets some of the policy that provides protection for some of these groups. But in recent years, Zhou Yongkang has been kicked out of the party and under investigation by the Committee of Discipline and the Organization Department. And his fall highlights how the central government is, especially through this anti-corruption campaign, is reasserting their power over these special interest groups. A lot of this is also linked to an economic reform agenda. So this big corruption campaign that's being instituted by Xi Jinping right now has been going in sectors. So they've done the military, the financial sector, the national oil companies. And a lot of it is to do reform within these industries. So make the military more efficient or make their economy more privatized, more market-oriented. But a lot of it, but there's also a dual purpose of consolidating power and having a more coherent foreign policy. A couple of other tools that they have are the organization department, which I mentioned earlier, that picks how different people rise to positions of power in the party. So the central government still has that. It's been referenced as the most powerful human rights organization, or sorry, not human rights. Most powerful, definitely not human rights, the most powerful human resources organization in the world. So just think about the power that appointment power has. And a little bit more about that appointment power is what has happened to the national oil companies is in stark contrast to how business leaders have still grown in power, or at least stayed stable in power. So the Central Committee is China's basically legislative body in times when their National Congress is not meeting. National Congress only meets every 5 years. So for 4 years and 12 months minus a day, this is like the Central Committee. And you can see how membership has from 2002 to 2007 increased, and then 2012 also increased, and especially the full members is a big thing because full members have voting power. But this is in stark contrast to what has happened in the petroleum clique. So a Brookings report in 2007 listed all these people, at least the first 6, as rising oil stars, people who, because of their connection to this petroleum power base in the central government in China, we're gonna move into positions of provincial government. We're gonna soon move into Politburo Standing Committee. We're gonna be making these big policy decisions, at least in 2007. Since then, 4 out of the 6 have been expelled from the Communist Party, which basically means your political career is over. 2 of them have been relatively successful. So one is the mayor of Beijing, and one is currently on the Politburo Standing Committee. So that shows that they weren't just throwing random people out there. These were people who had a lot of potential. And then Zhen Qinghong is also a key figure, this last guy. There are some reports that he is under house arrest. Epoch Times is a questionable source. They have a known anti-communist bias, but they've also, I don't know how I feel about the Epoch Times. They've also won some awards in journalism, investigative reporting from Canada. But his niece was removed from her post as the Guangzhou vice mayor. And usually when the Chinese government goes after your family members, you're the next to fall. So this guy had promoted the careers of a lot of these people. What's also interesting is Jiang Zemin, at one point was the head of the SASAC, which is the State Asset Supervision something committee, and that was the body that was responsible for regulating national oil companies, especially big national oil companies like especially big state-owned companies like the national oil companies. So you can see how this guy, who's clearly from an oil lineage and has the support of the oil industry, was also in place for regulating the oil industry. But since then, there's been a stark decline. And a lot of this is open. I just searched all these people's names. A lot of this is open, is open, and sometimes even in English language sources on the web. Okay, so I think just like as a concluding thought for that section of Chinese government and central government re-expanding and consolidating power over these national oil companies. There's a couple of I just have some thoughts, I guess, some opinions that are not supported by much, but because I'm an undergraduate student, I guess I can say them. I think that there was an advantage to this this almost confusion and this almost unorganized foreign policy, and I think it's a type of strategic confusion almost, because you can say that, oh, it wasn't us doing these aggressive actions, it was just these quasi-government actors, these national oil companies acting up again. So it's almost like if you really do have the ultimate control, these national oil companies and these other interest groups can almost be like masking agents, or almost be like just disruptive players that aren't that disruptive. At the same time, the risk that comes with this strategic confusion is the risk for miscalculation. So if they do go way out of line, there is a risk for miscalculation and escalation from that. So it comes with costs and benefits, but I think that China wants to reassert control and wants to have more of a unified and coherent foreign policy in the South China Sea. And then for the last 10 minutes, I just want to talk about some of these other interest groups with Chinese characteristics and how, as the central government has been reasserting more control over the NOC interest group, perhaps I want to posit that these national oil companies are responding through, view it as almost asymmetric warfare, through cooperating with these other interest groups at the margin and seeing what they can do to still maintain their interests and maintain their power. So the first group is the provinces. Provincial governments, there are three that are near the South China Sea: Hainan, Guangdong, and Guangxi. And they all have strong economic interests in development in the South China Sea, so they've all been active players, especially Hainan. Hainan in, I think, 1988 basically asserted that they have jurisdiction over the entire South China Sea. That's in China's territorial sovereignty claims. So one thing I want to talk about, I think there are three ways that provinces can assert power over the South China Sea. The first is the jurisdiction thing that I just mentioned with Hainan. So they have official legitimacy claims. The second is they have connections with maritime agencies. So sometimes there will be dual postings where a government official in a province is also the state Oceanic Council leader or has control over maritime agencies that do enforcement procedures in the South China Sea. One big example of that is provincial governors are also the party secretaries of a province, and the party secretary. So the way China's government organization works is there's almost two layers, but they're functionally one layer. So the party post will usually correlate with a official government post. So technically the party and the government are still separate. But in the case of provincial governors, they are also the leading party head in that region. So they have control over local coast guards, they have control over local fishing vehicles, they have control over local search and rescue vessels, law enforcement, all of that. The third is advocacy. So Hainan has also can advocate to the central government. For example, they've advocated in the past to decentralize energy right partitioning in the South China Sea. So those are three very powerful channels to influence South China Sea policy, and state-owned oil companies are aware of that. And national oil companies in particular, CNOOC, have worked with Hainan. This is the signing of a strategic cooperation agreement that happened last year. This is a picture from that. And at that agreement, CNOOC agreed to help Hainan build an international tourism island in the South China Sea, which Hainan has been agitating very much for, and the central government has been hesitant to support that. CNOOC has invested over 40 billion yuan in Hainan for oil and gas infrastructure. And Hainan also faced a deficit of 1.2 billion cubic meters in natural gas consumption last year. So they are also in some ways dependent on national oil companies. So there's a lot of leverage there between these groups. Okay, this is what I was talking about in terms of the whole complicated thing. So this South China Sea force structure doesn't even include Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other agencies that don't have vessels attached to them. This is just a force structure diagram. So obviously there's the PLA Navy. One interesting note about the PLA Navy is when the oil rig was deployed, there were actual military ships that accompanied that oil rig deployment. So you can see how there's definitely conflict, but there's also coordination between the central government and these national oil groups. That's another example of that maybe strategic confusion that I was talking about earlier, or whether the central government is using these groups. But here, just don't look at the Coast Guard yet, but basically, look, there's marine surveillance, there's fishery law enforcement command, there's the customs, Ministry of Public Security that I talked about earlier. All of these had their own force structures in the South China Sea. But recently, China has reorganized them under a Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard is responsible for 4 of these. So the 4 I just mentioned and the 4 that are in bold. But what is interesting to note is things with the arrows note direct control and budgetary control over. So provincial governments still have budgetary control, and people who are analyzing this Coast Guard were very emphasize this, that they still have direct budgetary control over their own local customs unit, over their own local Coast Guard unit, over their own fisheries enforcement command. So I think this is another example, the Coast Guard, the central government trying to institute this Coast Guard to make a more coherent maritime policy, is another example of central government trying to reassert, to expand, to control these interest groups. But the fact that provincial governments still have these 4 links to their own agencies, to their own vessels, is an example of this asymmetric conflict that is still happening, and how provinces still have some power. So I guess one other parallel mention to this is, for years, China has been trying to push a super energy ministry. And there have been bodies that have tried to coordinate different things, but national oil companies have been very successful in fighting back against this super energy ministry that would take over control and regulation of these national oil companies. So that could be one parallel to what's happening with the provinces. The second group that I want to talk about are think tanks. This one I'm not as familiar with. This was kind of like an add-on to my research, but I've started to research it more. And one that I definitely want to point out is the National Institute of South China Sea Studies. And this think tank is basically the one that is referenced when any major news organization with a China presence reports on South China Sea issues. You can look at, go even search on Google News right now or anything that's related to South China Sea. You'll probably see this think tank or the director reference. The director is Wu Shincun, and Wu Shicun, sorry. And basically, what he'll do is, especially I analyzed the oil rig deployment, and basically every step of the way, from the deployment to the backlash to did they find any oil, the think tank would serve as justifying that action and then expanding the potential of that action. So they reported that they found very successful oil and gas reserves. Those numbers are not available to the public. So this from CNOOC's exploration of that deployment of the oil rig, but a lot of news agencies have just taken this as fact. This think tank is technically under the control of the central government because it's the only national level state official think tank really that deals with South China Sea Studies issues. And I've ran across a couple of other figures in the think tank space. For example, one person who runs a think tank on South China Sea issues in Xiamen, who's also often quoted with Wu Shicun, he's listed as a CNPC independent non-executive director. I have no idea what that means, but he's in the CNPC website staff directory. So that's what makes China difficult to research, is these quasi-governmental groups that have interests in promoting the government interests at times, that have interests in increasing their presence, increasing their soft power, increasing their reputation, which has obviously happened since this National Institute of South China Sea Studies was established. And one reason why national oil companies, they do funding and they do research with these think tanks, and they have people, they have people, they want to get people that are associated with them onto the boards and onto the senior scholar positions of these think tanks, is because think tanks can offer a filter for the media message that comes from actions in the South China Sea. They can provide a legitimacy shield. So that is another area of interest group interaction on the second level. And then I just created just a basic sketch of a potential interactive framework for how national oil companies and the central government influence each other. So you have the revolving door phenomenon that I talked about earlier, as to how national oil companies, the heads of them, get into very high-level positions in the central government. The official policymakers try to combat that through anti-corruption efforts, through the organization department, through the SASAC body I mentioned earlier, and then all these other linkages through which they go through more marginal means, the national oil companies, through think tanks and subnational governments to influence the central government. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. It's still like a very exploratory stage, but thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So our first question is, you don't mention Xi Jinping much. How big is his role in the recent trends?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some China watchers, people who are constantly scouring Chinese language sources, say Xi Jinping, his first term hasn't even ended, and he's slotted for another 5 years after 2017, has said that he's risen to become one of the most powerful Chinese leaders, or the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. I don't know if I agree with that assessment. I think that there's a lot more institutional structure development in China, as I've mentioned, and I think that that there are more checks on his power, but at the same time, the anti-corruption campaign that I mentioned, Xi Jinping has been the main driver over that. And he's been the main driving force over that. So it is very tied to his aims to, when I say central government consolidating power, I am referring to Xi Jinping and his close subordinates consolidating power.
So if the central government has reasserted control, does that suggest a more cautious or more joint development-oriented approach to policy in the South China Sea?
That's also a really good question. I think that the central government in the South China Sea, the issue with even saying central government is, I try to simplify it and just saying central government, but as I mentioned earlier, even within the central government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has always been much, or in recent years has always been much more, you could say progressive or much more liberal in their outlook in terms of, we want to participate in international forums, we want to participate in international law. The professor that I had at Peking University, he very clearly stated this, and his line of thinking, or the books that he publishes, are more in line with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But he also mentioned that the central government, that also includes PLA thinkers and more nationalist thinkers. And he also mentioned that he has colleagues who are on that line of the spectrum. So even within the central government, there is division over how to proceed. The answer to that is, it's complicated and it's very hard to predict. Yeah.
What percentage of known oil supplies is located in the South China Sea?
So predictions of oil in the South China Sea differ very greatly. China's estimates are very, very high. Over 200 billion barrels of oil and gas are some of the Chinese estimates. And actually, there's a very interesting interaction between so these estimates happened very, very early on when technology wasn't even that good. They happened in that 1990s stage that I was talking about earlier, before, right when oil demand there was an oil crisis. And those estimates then became, CNOOC really entrenched those estimates. CNOOC really promoted those estimates as the basis, because if there's a lot of oil and gas predicted in the South China Sea, then it becomes even stronger of an interest, and it's tied to national interests. U.S. Energy Information Administration predicted 11 billion barrels, so it's a huge disparity, but they did predict over 20 billion barrels of natural gas. So natural gas is a big factor. Don't think it's just oil just because of its NOCs. China is transitioning more to natural gas, and so Hainan, because of their deficit, is importing natural gas. So that is also a factor. I would lean toward, I think most of the most qualified think tanks and the people that are using surveys from like the U.S. Geological Service conclude more toward the 11 billion side estimate, which is still substantial, because if the region is facing energy shortfalls, so any external energy source is important. Yeah.
And I think this next question follows really well. What is the impact of the cooperation with Russia on energy issues and the NOC?
I hadn't really considered the cooperation with Russia angle, as if that's referencing like Central Asia pipelines, or in the Northeast, like Vladivostok area. I don't know. I think like the Russia issue may be separate because there's not an explicit sovereignty claim. So, I think China would be I think there's many instances of joint development that have happened. One of the most prominent is China-Japan. So I think they're happy to jointly develop. Like these national oil companies, when they're going abroad, even coming to the US, they partner with multinational corporations. So it's not like China doesn't want to cooperate. One big hurdle to that is in any joint venture, CNOOC or any of these three NOCs have to own 51% of the venture. So that is one hurdle to that sustainable cooperation.
So I just want to say the last question is a personal question. I don't know that Jeffrey has agreed to take any personal questions. And if you've known Jeffrey since his first year at the University of Iowa, you know that he's extremely self-effacing and modest about his accomplishments. But I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all the people in the honors program who are here today, who worked with Jeffrey in getting this amazing opportunity to go to Oxford. And the question is, if Jeffrey will take it, what will be your course of study at Oxford, and what is your dream job in the future?
Probably not to be a South China Sea researcher, but I will be studying for an MPhil in international relations, so I'll be at Oxford for 2 years. One place, I don't know, recently, I've been getting the job question a lot, and I prefer to answer it in the sense of what type of work do you want to do? So I would love to be in the room or prepping people who are going to be in the room when U.S. and China negotiate climate pact, or when in these South China Sea Code of Conduct negotiations, who's in the room for that? So I would love to do that type of work.
We now conclude our program. On behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, I give a big thank you to Jeffrey Ding for his presentation. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. Again, we also thank our sponsors today, Midwest One Bank and Mace and K. Braverman, and we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. Jeffrey, as a small token of our appreciation, we present you with the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. Thank you again for joining us. We are adjourned.